Whoops.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight on our fall preservation school. Can't believe it's fall already. This is the first class, so we have several more the rest of the Thursdays, same time, 6 o'clock for the rest of the month. You can check out our website, hdc.org, if you want to come to any of the other ones. All of our previous classes are recorded and available on our YouTube page as well as the Preservation School page on our website. So if you haven't done so already, please check those out. We have some great classes. This is a first. We've never done an oral histories class, so I'm very excited. I hope you guys are too. And this is co-sponsored with NYPAP, the New York Preservation Archive Project. So we are very thankful to them, and we're going to hear all about oral histories and why they are important for preservation and how they help navigate and understand all of our histories, really. And so I will hand it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dezick. Welcome, as Michelle said. Thanks for having me in this first oral history session. So as Michelle said, I'm going to talk about how you can utilize oral history interviews within the context of historic preservation. And I do a lot of interviews about New York City history, and a lot of those interviews include information about preservation. So I'm going to talk about the different ways that preservation has come up in interviews or been the focus of interviews, so that you can start to think about who you might want to interview and why, and what interviews you might seek out from archives. So I'm going to talk a little bit and share some slides, and then I'm going to share some interview examples throughout that we can listen to. And then we should have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer questions. So if I go over anything and you think of a question, then just write it down and we'll get to it at the end. All right. So one of the reasons I find historic preservation so interesting to talk about in the context of oral history interviews is that it brings in so many different topics. So we can talk about architecture, talk about demographics, the inner workings of city politics. We can talk about grassroots organizing. We can talk about the pressures imposed by development or real estate and rising rents. We can talk about the balance of interests and motivations for preserving buildings. And oftentimes people who are involved in a coalition to preserve a building or a site or a neighborhood represent different interests and areas of investment, and also different cultural knowledge. So there's a real opportunity for dimensionality when your point of entry in oral history is historic preservation. And this is true of, I think, any advocacy or activist movement. You find a lot of intersecting pieces coming together. And oral history interviewing is a great way to explore all of these topics. Some people will know a lot about one of these kinds of topics, and whereas others will know a little bit about all of them. And when you have the opportunity to talk to multiple people about the same issue, you'll start to see that the story will get more rich. Maybe different opinions will emerge. You'll hear about unsung heroes, serendipitous events, and get a sense finally to see exactly how this preservation story might be unique from others. So I want to offer a definition of oral history next. So I'll read this slide. Oral histories are exchanges recorded with permission that are firsthand accounts of a person's everyday life, career, their witnessing of historical events, participation in social movements, or involvement in community-based activities. The recordings of these exchanges are usually saved and made available for research, community use, or family use, and they aim to contain information that would otherwise be lost to history. The oral history interview marks the creation of a new historical record. So the words that I've included in bold are some of the most important elements of oral history, and also the terms that oral historians often revisit and redefine. Oral history is a practice-based field that's guided by ethics and the fundamental goal of practicing in a way that's not extractive to individuals or communities. And practice often reveals new and important aspects of our definition or shows us precisely where our practice is failing to uphold what we name as important in our definition. And it's a field that's based around people, and people and our priorities and capacity are always changing. So if you know a little bit about oral history and this definition seems different, don't panic. If you are just getting started with oral history and you come across other definitions, that's just how it is. But these are the key elements that you'll find, I think, in pretty much any definition. But I'm going to go through in a different format, a kind of checklist, and talk a little bit more in detail about each of these elements. So oral history is a firsthand account. You're focusing on someone's experiences and their perspectives, and you're limiting how much you ask somebody to speculate about someone else's actions or motivations. So you can ask somebody why they think their neighbor was opposed to some sort of preservation effort, but also interview the neighbor too, if you can. So you can, as I said in the beginning, get a fuller picture, a richer picture of the movement. Oral history is also long form, responsive, and generative. So it's pretty much the opposite of conducting a survey. You want to provide an open space for someone to share what's important to them and what they witnessed and what that felt like, not confine them to a kind of pre-designed question set. So follow somebody into the territory where they lead you so that you can learn something new. Oral history also addresses gaps in historical records. So you should be knowledgeable enough about the topics that are going to be covered in the interview to know what's been well documented and where the gaps are. And you should seek to fill in those gaps. So if you already know the answers to the questions that you're asking, I have to ask, why are you asking those questions? So there's nothing wrong with hearing multiple people's accounts of the same event. But if one person has shared their experiences in some other place before, start from that point, ask them questions about that rather than asking them to repeat themselves and, tell the story of this, event again. Oral histories are also recorded with permission. In oral histories, we rely on informed consent, meaning that we let people know what we're going to do with the interviews and make sure that they have an understanding of what those uses will be before we press record. Sometimes we don't know what the uses are going to be. Sometimes we're just doing an interview to learn some information. And in that case, my advice is to just be as transparent as possible with somebody and let them know, right now I'm just doing research, but if anything else comes of this interview, I'll let you know. I'll keep you informed. So we don't ever think about somebody signing away their rights in oral history. That's a much more flexible term or a much more flexible agreement in oral history because they ultimately want to be building a respectful relationship with someone. And oral histories are archived for future access. So what this really means in practice for somebody who isn't a digital archivist, and I'm not a digital archivist, is that you're doing your best to save the recording and label it clearly and create at least one backup, if not more. Secondly, you share it if somebody asks. So exceptions to this would be if you're writing a book or something and you want to wait until your book comes out to release some interviews that you've done. But for the most part, you're taking care to save that file. And oral histories are also shared in varying ways to audiences. So this can mean a lot of things, but the most important thing to understand is that when you interview someone, you shouldn't consider that interview to be yours or mine. Oral histories aren't intended to make you or me smarter or more educated on a topic, or to enable you or me to be a more prominent expert on a topic, because that would be extractive, right? They're intended to document and to amplify or codify or work alongside a movement or share someone's story. So if somebody wants to share their interview with family or community or a museum, that's choice. That's their choice, and you should do what you can to facilitate that. And the general idea is that you're interviewing people who don't have information about them circulating in the world, and that having this information circulate is a good and mutually desired goal in the interview. And the ideal habitat of an oral history is for it to be in circulation, not hidden on a hard drive somewhere, or hidden in an archive either. Okay, so I want to talk next about some examples where oral history is a great tool to consider in a historic preservation context. And I'll also show you two places where you can look for existing preservation oral histories that have already been conducted, as they're there for you to use. So the first place that I want to point out is Village Preservation, which just, I think, released their new website this week. And they have a lot of oral histories, a lot. And a lot of those have to do with preservation. I've included a link here on the bottom, and I can share this presentation with you guys as a PDF if you want to visit that later. But the first person I want to point out is somebody who I interviewed for Village Preservation. So sometimes there may be a lot of writing and research that already exists about a particular person or a particular topic. And they may have been prolific in their career and have produced lots of papers and written dissents and published reports, et cetera. And in a case like this, oral history can still be a really good method because it's used to create a first-person narrative account, which can kind of connect all of those things together. So this is often less formal than a report. It's more nuanced, maybe more honest, more tactile. And it can also focus on motivations that fueled actions, sources of support, or obstacles that people have overcome. And it can also be a way to comment on or counter popular perceptions. So the first person I wanted to share is Beverly Moss Bat, which many of you may know. She is either on the HDC board or on the board of advisors. And she's been a planner in New York City for decades. She's retired, but and as you can see, she was chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission from 74 to 82, and she was the first woman to be chair as well. So because of the nuances of Zoom and screen sharing, et cetera, what I'm going to try to do is to send you the link to the audio, and we'll all together listen to this little short minute and a half clip of Beverly in our own computers. And that way you'll be able to hear it better. And I think I'll be able to keep my screen up so that you can read along if you like. So bear with me while I do a little jumping around here. Okay. All right, so does everybody see the chat? There's a link in the chat. And if you click on that, we can all listen together through our own headphones. If anything is confusing, just you can unmute and let me know, and we'll try it another way. Oh, and the clip is the very top link on the page. Did everybody get a chance to finish listening to that?
Yep.
Thanks.
Great.
There's another audio clip like this that we're going to listen to. So if that experience is horrible for you, we can try it another way. Welcome to Zoom audio. So you get such a strong sense of who Beverly is from this and what she is like as a person. And you also learn that some of her most notorious professional moves were really intricately bound up with her her personal life and her role in this case as a mother and a wife. Um, so anyone who's done research in an archive and Beverly's papers are at Brown, you know that when you're sorting through all these materials, you kind of inevitably wish that you could ask this person that you're looking at, you know, all their papers and their life's work, you know, how or why and what about this? And interviews like this are a really great opportunity to ask those questions directly of people who have produced all those materials and resources that are valuable for study, and to ask those hows and whys. And oral historians will always say that you should ask a person about those topics directly if you can. And so in this case, you know, Beverly might have been known publicly as a maverick dissenter, which she was referred to in the Times, but that's not how she saw herself. So if you're interested in preservation history and doing research about the history of preservation, this is the kind of interview that you'll find to be very useful. Other times you might encounter a situation where information is known, widely known and circulates informally, but there's no record or documentation. So in the context where it's necessary to provide citations and references, such as when you're arguing for designation, in some cases, an oral history interview will transfer that verbally, collectively known, circulated information into a historical record in an archive. So here I want to talk about Paula Delucia Pons, who I also interviewed for Village Preservation. Paula and her husband Larry Pons are both artists and have lived for decades in 827, 831 Broadway, which is just south of Union Square, which was suddenly one day slated for demolition. And there was a quick movement to try to document all the things that had happened in this building, a real cultural epicenter, and to use that as a way to collect information to use in to make the case that the building should be not only not demolished, but protected with designation. So I'm going to share another link with you, if that's all right. Okay, so there's the link. You can click on that and listen to the clip, the top option on the page. Are we good? Did we hear Paula? Great. So I should say, when she talks about her husband dripping paint, that's a style of his, an artistic style or era from his work. So here we see this snippet of the life of artists whose, art practices are actually become part of the building itself, and the texture of the building. And I should add that a whole other aspect of this, the story of this building, had to do with musicians recording music, and that actually the apartment is big enough for there to be a room with a basketball hoop where musicians and artists used to play basketball to kind of blow off steam after they recorded music. So it's really a tremendous place where so many different kind of cultural activities happened. So, and this interview was, as I said, specifically conducted to document this and to kind of get all the stories into one place. And it was used to make the case to landmark the building. So for oral history, it had a remarkably fast turnaround time. Usually there's the process of interviewing and getting everything completed is much longer. Mary Habstrit will know that, who I was lucky to interview this summer. All right, another kind of example where oral history is really useful is where there are only a small group of people who are aware of the intricate details around a particular preservation story. And but that actually has much bigger implications on a city level or neighborhood level. And this is often true with preservation efforts that happen in the outer boroughs or anywhere where people who mobilize do so on a grassroots level and sometimes outside the sphere of institutions that are active in preservation, and outside the interest of media, and also potentially outside the sphere of any kind of academic research as well. So I want to talk about the New York Preservation Archive Project's collection next, and this is just kind of a screenshot from their website of the materials that they have. And to share the next interview snippet, I will take you to their website. We'll do the sharing and the listening to the excerpt in a little bit of a different way. But a few years ago, NYPAP did interviews with people who were part of preservation movements that were underrepresented in the media and archives. And these interviews focused on preservation efforts that were often led by Black people and people of color, or they were about cultural sites or neighborhoods with historic connections to Black and Latinx Americans. And that particular project of interviews in that scope is called the Saving Preservation Stories Project. So we're going to go there now. So you'll be able to see navigating the website. And then we're going to watch a short snippet of a video, which was made for marketing purposes. So it doesn't really feel right to watch the whole thing in this context, but I'll play a short snippet for you. All right. Let me get there first. Okay, we should be seeing the browser now. So this is Saving Preservation Stories on NYPAP's website. And I'm just going to navigate to the portion of the video that we're going to play. And the video is with Denise Brown Purrier and Deborah Young, who are co-founders of the Crown Heights North Association and have done a lot of preservation work in Brooklyn.
I think the biggest impact was made.
Can you all hear that?
Yep, sounds good.
When we were at the Historic District Council meeting, and when we all showed up, and we were all African American, except Drake Todd. And I saw the expressions on people's faces, and they were surprised. They were surprised. And a lot of things we do in our own communities, we do them quietly and silently. There's no press, there's no publicity. No one's coming out to see. Yeah, they'll come out with a news bite or sound bite on something tragic, but the positive things, which are plentiful throughout our communities and always have been, are not highlighted. So that impact just initially was really, that sticks with me.
Okay, so you can watch the whole video if you like on your own time if you want to go back to that. But I wanted to share that small piece with you because, and I'll read the kind of quote that I really wanted to focus on in case the Zoom audio was a little difficult to hear. Denise says, a lot of the things that we do in our own communities, we do them quietly. And she emphasized quietly. And so I wanted to share this as an example of how the activities and demonstrations that are related to preservation movements are not the same for every neighborhood, and they're not the same for everybody. And and that also is reflective of different kinds of places that are being preserved as well. So this interview is specifically about preservation in Crown Heights North, but they are great organizers. And so this interview is an important resource in addition to the other interviews in the Saving Preservation Stories collection, because they are about a grassroots preservation movement. And anybody who is an advocate for preservation or wishes to have an advocacy role in various areas around the city, essentially meeting the need as they arise based on development or what have you, you need to start by learning from community organizers about what's going on in that neighborhood. Historic preservation doesn't always go by that name. So you might also notice that there are two people in this interview. So in the interview, they talked about how they were a perfect match for each other in terms of getting involved with historic preservation and also carrying out their preservation efforts, which they did side by side. And they were able to complement each other's strengths in the interview itself, and then also were comfortable enough with each other personally to share, background information about each other. So obviously, if you are thinking about a small group interview, you need people who will do well together in that context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about formats, different kinds of formats. So as I said, you can do interviews that are one-on-one, which is far and away the majority of interviews that I do are one-on-one. But there are times, as I said, such as with Denise and Deborah, that a small group is a good idea. So by small group, I think, 2 or 3 people is ideal. When you get into the realm of maybe 5 or 6, then that kind of becomes a little bit of a different animal. And as I said, a group interview is good for people who were, maybe on the same side of an issue. It could be a little tense if you have people who are on different sides of an issue and people may not feel comfortable fully voicing, their thoughts and their perspectives and where they were coming from. Interviews are also, they can be in person or they can be remote. I've been doing interviews remotely since March, and it's been all right. But the majority of interviews that I've done in the past have been in person. And, I think, moving forward into, a future that we all hope will happen, I think it'll still be important to check in with people regarding things like, health concerns and if they're disabled and don't want to travel, essentially to have a conversation about, can I do this interview with you in person, or do you prefer that we do it remotely? If we have the technology now, why not make that an option? But I will say that when you're talking about preservation issues and place-based history, it's really nice to be able to be in the place, to show up to that neighborhood, to see somebody's house that they've had for 50 years, or see the neighborhood that they've protected, and to really show up in that way and experience the place. So depending on the subject of your interview, you may want to make all efforts to be there in person. Another format question is whether you might use audio or video. And I always tell people to use the highest quality that you can manage. And this is not just so that the interviews are more pleasant to listen to or pleasant to watch. It's because the high quality files are better for long-term digital preservation. You want those files to live as long as you can. And if you're, and I'll say that I can answer any questions that you have about equipment if you're at that point at the end. But if you're collaborating with an institution that has a digital archivist, you can talk to them about file storage, or maybe you can borrow their equipment if they have it, or utilize their transcriptionist, or whatever they have that you need. And you can always reach out to an organization to see if they want to collaborate in some way. And I would say that a place like the New York Public Library, or the what is it now, the Brooklyn History Center, formerly known as the Brooklyn Historical Society, a place like that may not want a couple interviews here and there about a subject that you're interviewing on, because it may be difficult for them to add it into their collections and their current workflow. You can ask them, but my sense is that a small archive like NYPAP that specifically focuses on preservation, we do want your interviews, and we do want to talk to you about, getting a copy of whatever you do. So by all means, reach out and see if there's ways to collaborate with either NYPAP or another institution that you have in mind. But if you're recording on your own and you're doing this on your own, a couple quick AV tips: introduce the recording. So when I start a recording, I say, today is October 8th, 2020, and this is Sarah Desick interviewing whoever it is, Kamala Harris, for whatever oral history project. And then if we take a break and we start up again, introduce that second file too. This is a resuming of the interview with so-and-so on such and such a date for this project. We have so many files on our computer that are kind of automatically numbered or labeled with numbers and letters, and we always think that we're going to come back to them and find them and organize them, and we rarely do, probably. So, put all that information into the file, put all that information into the file name, put all that information into the folder name. I always think about, if somebody finds out, I interviewed their parent or grandparent 20 years ago, and they find me somehow and they say, do you still have this interview recording with my parent or grandparent? That's the person that I have in mind when I go through the trouble of organizing all my files. I want to be able to provide that file for somebody should they find me. So in terms of length, interviews are usually 1 to 2 hours per session. And occasionally we do interviews that are multiple sessions, particularly if we're looking at somebody's life, we're doing a full life history. So, but it will depend on the level of detail that someone's able to provide, or the amount that they were engaged in a particular activity. So sometimes people who have just sort of a small level of involvement are able to provide a ton of detail, and it's worthwhile to talk to them for as much as possible, or about as much as possible. And then other times, people who are really at the helm don't really have a lot of detail to share. So it isn't a kind of black and white issue. You'll have to figure it out based on the person. But even within a single, 1 to 2 hour session, you still have time to ask about somebody's life and to welcome them to contextualize their preservation work within their life in a more full context. So remember that oral histories are long form and responsive and generative. And sometimes people ask questions about this, I don't really see how me talking about my childhood is really related to this preservation effort, but it's really helpful. It's only usually, 10 minutes of an interview. It doesn't take that long. And it just kind of provides people with a lot of tools to be able to kind of make sense of their life and their motivations and why they're, why they were invested. And, I think it's particularly useful and important in interviews that relate to preservation to ask about how somebody got a sense of or got interested in history, or became interested in place-based history, or the places that were really meaningful to them when they were younger. So I would encourage you to, 1 to 2 hours, it's either long or it's short, depending on how you think about it. But I would encourage you to feel free to ask some questions about somebody's life outside of the particular issue or topic that you're interviewing about. So some interviews live mostly in the world as transcripts, which is sort of ironic that they become these written formats. And sometimes other interviews exist as, audio or their original video. Sometimes interviews exist in full, sometimes they exist in excerpt form that may be used for exhibits or just sort of, are shared in a kind of online collection. So these are all decisions that are in part determined by your funding and financing. And then they're also determined in some ways by your purpose. What are you doing the interview for? So if you're following along, you probably realize that there's a lot involved in oral history. And beyond what I've described so far, or maybe kind of implicit or embedded in what I've described, is that you're creating and sustaining relationships with people who you interview. So if you are part of a movement or you're invested in learning from a movement, this is also usually a goal that you already have. So in a way, it's a lot of work, but it's also potentially a good fit for historic preservation work. And the last one here is interviews that are done in public, a kind of public interview. So I'm going to explain this using an example also from NYPAP. So NYPAP did a project last year with on the roots of LGBTQ preservation. And it included interviews with people who have been advocating for the preservation of sites with cultural significance to the LGBTQ community. They've been doing this work for decades. And you can kind of think of the designation of the Stonewall Inn as a National Historic Landmark as kind of the culmination of decades of hard work, just to set a precedent. So the designation of the Stonewall Inn was significant, but the precedent of designating a site with cultural significance to the LGBTQ community was also imperative in being able to designate future sites using that cultural significance. So in this project, each of the people who were interviewed for about 2 hours about their involvement in this movement. And then NYPAP hosted this public session. And the goals here were to, one, share this history about this preservation movement with an audience. Two, to bring these folks together, as I said before, to kind of reinforce or counter each other's perspectives. And three, to get feedback from the audience and to hear their memories too, in this context, which was a happy hour event at a gay bar in Hell's Kitchen. So during this event, we shared clips from each narrator's full-length interview, and then we asked them some follow-up questions that they could answer out in the context of this public event. So occasionally others would jump in and provide some more comment or correct each other or give credit where somebody wasn't taking it. And I'm going to play a clip from Jay Shockley, which in this clip he takes us back to where his thinking was at the time when taking some steps to designate historic LGBTQ sites started to kind of coalesce and garner momentum for him.
The first realization was that historic preservation has always been a gay-centric profession. And even if it isn't a gay-centric profession, there are all sorts of gay connections, whether it's, the almost stereotypical thing of gay people moving into abandoned neighborhoods, fixing up the houses that happens in small towns, big cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a growing sense that not only historic preservation, but all of the related professions, archivists, librarian, historians, there were lots and lots and lots of gay men and lesbians in the profession. So once you realize that, you know, you are part of a huge group of people that is in the profession, ultimately you realize, well, you're dealing with everybody else's history, every other minority group's history. Why is nobody considering us and, you know, what's important to us as a community and what, as a community, we've contributed to American history and culture?
So this is a really great use of oral history to go back to, you know, what was somebody thinking at the time? You know, what was it like then? You know, what was the kind of realization that you had that made you take this step to start organizing? And I also chose this clip because it's something that would take other people in the audience back to what that time was like, this before Stonewall landmark time. And I can remember at the event, Andrew Dolkart reiterating how hard they had worked for that designation. I mean, everybody was in good spirits having, looking back on this time, but he really reiterated what a struggle it was and why it was a struggle and the discrimination that they faced during this time. And so, in a way, they were able to kind of counter each other's emotion to tell the story in a way that was more complex and complicated, and a story that isn't just about what did we do and what did we publish and what website do we have now, but it's also a story that is affective and a story about changing perceptions of themselves and changing perceptions of them from outsiders as well. And that history, you know, as we look back, has to be remembered. We can't forget it instantly, even though now we have these this new precedent and we have Stonewall as a national monument. So I think with that, we're ready for about 15 minutes or so of questions. And I have a lot more detailed information to share, but I want that information to be guided by what you all here want to know and where you're at in your own potential projects. Please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions or ask for clarification.
If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. That's probably easiest.
Okay.
Also, if you have a question, you can kind of write question in the chat, and then I can call on you as well, and you can ask your question out. Thanks for sharing those observations, Mary. Brian, curious about the equipment used in the interviews. Is there a transcription app? Another question about technology. Okay, so okay, I'll talk a little bit about remote interviews and in-person interviews. So even if you don't have the recorder that I use for in-person interviews is a Zoom, also a Zoom H5N. Here, I'll type it out. And that is a recorder that has pretty good built-in microphones, and you can also use, you can buy external microphones that are lapel mics. That's what I prefer, but it's a setup that you would use if you do interviews professionally, which I do. If you're just doing interviews to document people's experiences, but you want to be able to make sure you can discern what people say, that's a really good recorder to have. It has a lot of different kind of attachments that you can get for it that are all part of its sort of suite of materials. So it's easy to shop for, even if you don't have a lot of experience with recording equipment. Mm-hmm. And a couple things, if you can just get in a room where the person that you're interviewing and you are close to your recorder, that makes a huge difference in itself. It's not about the technology. It's really just about, are you, 2 or 3 feet from the microphones? It makes a huge improvement in the quality of the recording. And also to, if you can, get away from super echoey spaces, and choose a place that's nice and cozy, all these things that we're fantasizing about doing when the pandemic is over, getting nice and cozy with people we're interviewing. So those things would be super helpful. And it's easy to make a recording on that recorder and to transfer it to your computer and have it exist as either a WAV file, which is a better quality file, and to convert it as an MP3. And I do that all mostly in iTunes. So I don't even need to use special software for that.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah. But you can also, same thing goes if you have a smartphone, you can record using voice memo. And I would just say the same thing. Make sure that you're really close to the microphone. Make sure that your narrator is close to it. And highly recommend test recordings. Just see, what is it like if, you're 3 feet away from the microphone? Yeah, it sounds really echoey. You can't really hear it. If you're 1 foot away from the microphone, magic happens. All of a sudden you can hear, it's clear, it's great. So, I will say that most people don't really have phones where you can record a 2-hour recording without it getting full. Sometimes it's a little complicated if you are, needing to be connected to the Wi-Fi or, accepting calls. A phone, if you can make that the one purpose of the phone and you have enough space, you can make an interview work, just fine. Transcription apps, I do not use transcription apps. I work with people, and the people may use an app for like a first round. I'm not really sure, but if you get to the place where you've got interviews waiting to be transcribed, I or any other oral historian that you come across can definitely refer you to some people. And if you also just reached out to NYPAP, we could get you in touch with a transcriber that we use who I really love and who is not, who isn't particularly expensive as far as transcription goes. And when I do interviews remotely, I have been doing Zoom in part because a lot of people became familiar with Zoom really fast. And Zoom is just the thing that they used. They used it for family gatherings, they used it for work, they used it for synagogue, they used it for town hall meetings that they were tuning into all of a sudden. And so it was just the thing that people was familiar with. And I have tried out other secondary software. As you experienced, Mary, the one I used with you was called Zencastr. I'll type that as well, which I was pretty good, didn't love it. It is a little bit demanding on the part of the person that you're interviewing to kind of keep a window open and start things up. There's another thing that I do like a little better. It's called Squadcast, and it has a video component. It's used for podcasters use it. So it has a video component to it where you can see the person that you're interviewing, but it also records. And if anybody wants to kind of hear the details, when we record on Zoom, the recording is taking all of the audio input and it's combining it in the internet, and then it kind of spits it back out. So it usually sounds worse than how we sound to each other in the moment. Software like Squadcast or Zencastr, they record me on my end and you on your end, and then they combine those files. So the quality should be better, and it should have a little bit less of that Zoom audio sound, especially if you happen to have a microphone that's good on your end, which I don't. I just have this headphone microphone. But if you are doing, Zoom, it works perfectly fine. It's easy. You can go to the settings and set it to record. I think it works perfectly fine. It works a lot better if both people can wear headphones, because it just keeps, occasionally there's like a weird feedback that you might hear or a weird echo that you might hear in some calls. Even if you don't hear it live, you might hear it in the recording, and using headphones just seems to help with that. Cuts down on anything kind of feeding back in. Okay, what do you think are the best ways to approach community members about conducting interviews, especially when you aren't a member of that community? Yeah, that's a really tricky question. What I would say is that you can see if you can find some organizations that exist in that community and reach out to them in whatever way you're able to. If they have a website, then you can send them an email. If they have something like an Instagram or Facebook, get in touch with them that way. Whatever place it seems like they're active and corresponding with people. And you can just say, look, I have this, I have equipment, and I have, the ability to do some interviews. And is that something that interests you? I think if you're going to be, transparent about whatever your interests are, like I'm a student and I really want to, I'm really interested in this neighborhood for whatever reason, or I'm just getting involved in the preservation movement and I see that there are some activities happening here. Would something like oral histories be useful to you? These are things that I would do for you that you could have for your community. So it's really just a matter of saying, here's what I have to offer. Here's my interest. Of course, if you were saying like, I want to write a book about you and get rich and famous, obviously they're not, I would suggest that they not come running to you. But if you are, really interested in practicing interviewing, if interviewing is what's kind of driving you, then I would say that, I'm like looking to incorporate interviews into whatever preservation practice I have. But honestly, I haven't had much experience. Something that I would really like to interview people about is the work that you're doing. Is there any way that this is useful to you? And this kind of gets back to at the very beginning, saying that the definition of oral history is so often changing. And it's because sometimes we have this idea about, okay, the two of us are going to sit down and we're going to talk for 2 hours and it's going to be very formal, but like very useful to both of us. And in real life, people have different investments. They have, are busy. Someone says, oh, you want to do interviews? I want to do interviews because I want to make a play. I want to make a theater production of what we're doing right now. And that's great. I'm all for figuring out how to take interviews in oral history and put them out into the world and get them circulating in different forms. So, the truth is, if, I've been working as an oral historian for 10 years. And even if you get somebody to say yes to doing an interview when they don't really want to, you'll kind of never hear from them again. You'll never get everything that you need in order to be able to share those interviews. Everything just goes better when the people that you're interviewing are also invested in the process and have an idea about, here's how I might use this interview. Or yes, I really would like to talk about all these things that I've done together in context. And sometimes it's just not a good fit. And, for example, I reached out to a number of people, organizations at the beginning of the lockdown to say, hey, if you really need to process what's going on with COVID-19 and how it's affecting your community, I'm an interviewer. I have all these materials. If you think that would be beneficial to you and your group, please let me know. And I didn't hear back from anybody, and that's fine. It doesn't mean that I might not reach out to them again. It's a hectic, people have busy schedules. So, if somebody doesn't reach out to you, don't take it personally. It could be almost anything. But really, ultimately, you have to make sure that it's mutually beneficial. Right. Let's see. Did I get everybody's questions? Is anybody else have anything that they want to clarify? One thing that I would add is if you're finding yourself in the place where you're wondering, I really want to talk to somebody about, what they've done, but does it warrant an oral history interview, like a full, formal sit down thing? And for that, I would say, one thing that you can do is to do what maybe we'd call a pre-interview, where you can say, look, I think that you might know a lot of stuff that would be really helpful, but I'm not really sure. Is an interview a good idea? And you can sort of say, well, do you know when did this happen? What date was that? If you're sorting through facts with somebody, trying to sort out a timeline or, you know, these kind of detailed things, you might just start by having a conversation. And if somebody is like, you know what, I'm really remembering a whole lot of things here, I can provide a lot of detail, then you might find like, hey, let's set aside an hour or two, and that way we can like really go down memory lane and have you recall all of this really good information. But if you're really just trying to say, you know, that one person has this one letter that we sent, you know, maybe you can just talk to them about the letter and go from there. So, you know, you can always have conversations with people, figure it out together. You know, it's if you do a formal interview, it is okay to kind of go over the information that you've already talked about in the past, because you know, ideally the interview that you're doing will be shared with other people. So it's not just the information that you want to know the answers to, it's information that your peers and other people interested in preservation history will be interested in. Okay, are there any institutions with oral history archives that you particularly recommend? Yes, that's actually my last slide. And Michelle, can I send this presentation to you and you'll distribute it, hopefully to every participant?
Please, that'd be great.
Okay, so rather than sharing my screen again, I'll just read a few things. So first there's NYPAP, which is nypap.org. And from there you can find, they have a preservation history database, they have a saving papers collection, and then they have the oral histories. There's also Village Preservation, which is villagepreservation.org. And they have a ton of things on their website. Their blog is super helpful. They also have a preservation history archive. They have photographs, lots of stuff. And they have a tag for preservation or preservationists. And so you can sort things that way. And then I also recommend the Oral History Association website. That's our professional association. It's oralhistory.org. And you'll see I point you to a few different places on their website for remote interviewing, archives best practices, and then general principles and best practices. And then the last thing is Columbia University's Oral History Master of Arts program. They have workshops that you can attend remotely. They're Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m., I think, or maybe they're Wednesdays, but every so often they have public workshops where someone who does oral history practice talks about their work, which is like a book or a performance, you know, all kinds of things. And the Oral History Masters of Arts program also does training sessions seasonally. So those links are in what Michelle will send you. So you can just go directly to them and sign up and read about whatever you like.
Great,
so
you.
Hopefully that'll provide you with a ton more information. And of course, you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. My email is also in the presentation.
Great.
7:01, sorry, everybody. All right, well, with that, I think, Michelle, will we conclude?
I think that sounds good.
Great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. This was great.
Yeah, thanks. Hope to hear from some of you.
Yes,
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All next week at the next preservation school.
Oh,
Have a great night.
Great. Thank you.
Night.